As Ukrainian forces made steady gains taking back territory from Russian control for regions in the country's east held a referendum. Many in the international community called the vote illegitimate, and the fallout is already mounting against Moscow. But Russian President Vladimir Putin remained defiant, holding a ceremony at the Kremlin to formally announce the annexation of the Ukrainian regions.
Broken people of Donbass, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson made their choice. I want the Kiev regime and their sponsors from the West to hear me. I want everyone to remember that the people who live in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, now they become our citizens.
On Thursday, President Erdogan held a phone call with his Russian counterpart where he pressed Putin to take steps to reduce tensions in Ukraine. Earlier this week, the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson voted overwhelmingly to formally join the Russian Federation. But the referendum was denounced by most of the West, with allegations that residents had been pressured to approve Russia's annexation. Türkiye, which has been mediating between Kiev and Moscow, has called for dialogue and diplomacy to settle this latest crisis and the overall conflict. So what impact will the referendum and annexation have? And to further break down what Russia's annexation could mean, I'm joined by Amanda Poole in Brussels. She is a senior policy analyst at the European Policy Center, and by Andreas Umland. He is a political analyst with the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. Amanda, Russia has announced it has formally annexed 4 regions in southern and eastern Ukraine after holding self-styled referendums. So what's next moving forward?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, Russia has carried out a blatant land grab of occupied Ukrainian territory. I think this is a sign that Russia intends to escalate the situation on the ground. I think the move came from the Kremlin as a way to demonstrate that Russia has had some sort of success from its illegal invasion of Ukraine. Russia's military operation has been a catastrophe. Ukraine has been able to successfully push back Russia. So in a way to demonstrate that Russia has had some success, we have seen these illegal referendums, the annexation of these territories, as a show that Russia is, rescuing its Russian minorities and being successful in its operation in Ukraine.
Yes.
I think that what's next is that Russia will continue to escalate. This is why it's crucially important that the support from Ukraine's allies in the West, the US, the EU, etc., remains robust and effective. This includes ongoing substantial military aid to Ukraine.
Yes. So, Andreas, what's your take on that? I mean, would you agree with Amanda that Russia will continue to escalate the situation? I mean, what will the political fallout be for Russia? I mean, how do you think the international community will react to this annexation?
Well, there will be a negative reaction, but we should also say that the West has already applied many of the instruments that it has to exert pressure on Russia. And unfortunately, now the question is more and more which other instruments to use. And the further escalation that I see here also, and we'll see how Russia is going to then actually interpret this annexation that it is now conducting, is about the territories of the 4 oblasts, the 4 regions that it is annexing: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson.
Yes. The
territories that Russia has not yet occupying. So in a way, what is coming out of all of this, that now territory actually controlled not only legally but also factually, materially by Kiev, is now being declared Russian state territory.
Yes,
and that is, actually an absurd situation, and can of course be very dangerous as well.
Yes.
And unfortunately, one has to also fear here an escalation with weapons of mass destruction.
So Kremlin, Amanda, has just said any attack on annexed territory will be considered an attack on Russia. So what do you foresee? I mean, how would Zelensky respond to that? Is the Ukrainian army likely to step up its efforts to take back its territories?
I mean, absolutely. I would consider that the Ukrainian army will be as determined as ever to liberate the territories that are under occupation by Russia. I don't see any change in that position, and it's the correct position to have. I mean, anything else we shouldn't expect from Kiev. What's important is that Ukraine's allies in the West maintain their support for Ukraine's operations and the liberation of Ukraine's territory, because showing any signs to the Kremlin would be a complete disaster. And this is what the Kremlin is hoping for. I mean, the Kremlin is hoping that the more it escalates, the talk about the nuclear threat, etc., will erode Western support. Obviously, among the publics in Europe and elsewhere, that they'll become scared, and this will impact the support that currently exists for Ukraine.
But, Andreas, for how long can the US and Europe continue to provide Ukraine with military and financial aid amid the energy crunch as well as rising prices and inflation?
Well, that's a good question, but my feeling so far is that this support will continue, because I think more and more people understand that this is not a regional conflict, that this is a fundamental assault on international law. With regard to the annexation of Crimea 8 years ago, there was a part of the Western public that was sort of buying, at least partially, the Russian political, historical, and legal, I would say, pseudo arguments that Russia made in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. But now, actually, all of these arguments, they are invalidated by these new annexations, and Crimea now becomes a package,
Yes.
a part of a package of a larger imperial expansion. And it dramatizes the whole conflict to a new stage, I would say, and a fundamental violation of international law. And one of the biggest victims here is, of course, the non-proliferation regime, because the largest scandal, I would say, of this entire war is that Russia not only has nuclear weapons and behaves itself the way it behaves because it has nuclear weapons,
Yes.
but it is explicitly allowed to have nuclear weapons by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And Ukraine does not only have no nuclear weapons, but is also explicitly forbidden to have nuclear weapons by the same Non-Proliferation Treaty signed by 191 countries. And one of the most important treaties, I would argue, that humanity has at all. And now Russia, as an official nuclear weapons state, is taking territories away without any explanation. With Crimea, there was some sort of argument that was invalid, but was still accepted by some observers. But now we have just a very ordinary, very classical imperial expansion, which invalidates basically this treaty, because
Yes.
now many countries around the world will think, well, we could become victims as well, and what we need is actually the bomb to support ourselves, because we cannot rely on international law.
Yes. So, Amanda, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg earlier this week has called on allies to continue replenishing stocks as rapidly as possible. What did he mean by that?
I mean, he's calling for the allies to continue to supply Ukraine with modern weaponry, with high precision weaponry that is crucial for them to keep pushing back Russia, and which will also allow them to liberate territories. I mean, it's important that the flow of arms is consistent and continues to happen as often as possible. I mean, if it was up to me on a daily basis, that there should be no, long pauses in between arms deliveries, because Russia uses these pauses, to rebuild and regroup. So he's calling for the allies to do more and to do it quicker, and to give let's say, the highest level of modern weaponry that they can.
So, Andreas, as a NATO member country's president, Mr. Erdogan has voiced his displeasure at the referendums and saying that they created an obstacle to peace. So, could he still play a mediating role between Kiev and Moscow with this stance?
Well, that would be, I guess, a question to maybe an observer from Moscow, but the consistent position here of Turkey on the annexation of Crimea, now on these annexations, is, of course, for the Ukrainian side rather supportive, and that will make President Erdogan more acceptable for the Ukrainian side as a mediator.
So where would this, Amanda, leave Türkiye as a mediator?
I mean, if we're talking about Turkey's role as a mediator or a facilitator, I mean, I think that so far Turkey has shown actually it's the only actor that has been able to deliver something tangible to Ukraine. I mean, first of all, the grain deal, but also more recently taking a key role in the return of prisoners of war from Russia, which is really important. So I think that Ankara will continue to want to play this role going forward, as there's many different issues that do require international facilitation.
So if we get back to Putin's threats, Andreas, he said he wasn't bluffing about using nuclear weapons, and former President Dmitry Medvedev also backed him up in this threat. So how would Russia's allies respond to Russia's use of nuclear weapons? I mean, how would China, India, and former Soviet states react, you think?
Well, that is the big hope, that obviously the reaction from these countries would be negative. Again, because that would be a violation of a taboo and would undermine the non-proliferation regime, and would, of course, make many countries around the world nervous, many countries that do not have nuclear weapons. I'm therefore having rather dark thoughts here about something like repetition of what we've observed in Russia in 1999, when Putin came basically to power through a bombing of residential apartments in Russia, in Volgodonsk, in Moscow, in Buyansk. And before these bombings, Putin was unpopular, unknown. Then these bombings happened. They were apparently organized by the Russian Secret Service. And then in response to that, Putin started the Second Chechen War, and he then became, after these attacks on Russian residential buildings, he became very popular and won the 2000 presidential elections. And unfortunately, I have fears here that Russia may try to do something similar now on a larger scale, perhaps even with a weapon of mass destruction on Russia-controlled territory, either Russian state territory or the Ukrainian territory controlled by Russia. And then it would have a narrative why it can itself escalate against Ukraine with weapons of mass destruction.
So, Amanda, are we likely to see controlled escalations before it boils over into an all-out conflict between the West and Russia? I mean, what's your predictions here?
I mean, honestly, that's a million and $1 question, isn't it?
Yeah.
One can only hope that there'll be some sort of measured census from both sides. I mean, I think that President Putin is capable of doing anything, frankly speaking. I mean, we've already seen what he's capable of, but I think he can go much more. So it's not just about the response of the West. It's also has to do with the internal functioning in Moscow, whether there are people there still within his circle or outside of his circle who are able to have any influence over what he can possibly do next, particularly in terms of this nuclear threat.
All right, Amanda and Andreas, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.